Just full disclosure, I can't vote for Donald Trump. I don't think he's good for the country. I don't think he's a good dude either. I can vote for Vivek. Ladies and gentlemen, last time out, we reacted to Vivek Ramaswamy being interviewed by The Breakfast Club, and it was a total shit show. So I thought, well, this time we need to feature him in an interview when he's being questioned by someone a little bit more reasonable, perhaps a liberal with some more reasonable lines of questioning. And as it turns out, that person might have just come along. David Pakman of The David Pakman Show recently interviewed Vivek in something that I thought was fairly informative and entertaining. So let's check it out. I'm going to go through my thoughts. And before we get into this, I just want to say this actually isn't the main channel. We have a channel called Gestalt Productions. It makes very highly produced content. We only have 300 subscribers, but this is the kind of content that you would find on a channel with 100,000 plus subscribers.
Well, I think I'm much more humble than you would understand.
I would highly recommend you go check it out, especially a video on TikTok that I will put with a link up there. If you still want to stay here and watch this reaction video, I mean, I get it. We like watching Vivek. Vivek, he's third. He's third in the poll. He's in front of Mike Pence. And you know what? He says Trump did a good job. Okay, I know I'm terrible at this. Let's get into the reaction.
Fortunately or unfortunately is often my first question when we speak to candidates right now. It's just sort of like a sanity check, which I think you will pass, honestly.
Let's hope.
Is there any way to interpret that Donald Trump actually won the 2020 election, or did he lose the 2020 election?
The way you're framing the question, you're asking me a very specific question. Is there any way? Here's one important unexplored strand.
This is already great. He's asking him, do you think that when Republicans out here, when Dinesh D'Souza makes a documentary about the election being stolen from Donald Trump, do you think that that has any legitimacy? And this is good for conservatives to hear. I'm imagining a lot of the people coming to this channel to watch Vivek are coming from the perspective of a conservative. If someone on the left is confronted with the perspective that the election was stolen from Donald Trump, most folks will shut their ears off immediately. They won't listen to anything else that person has to say. And the fact that Vivek does not immediately say, no, the election was not stolen, is going to trigger some kind of backfire effect. It is very difficult to cut through the liberal bullshit-o-meter. That's what I'll call it, because doesn't mean that the point is bullshit. It means that the liberals who are confronted with the perspective immediately think that it's bullshit.
I'm a data-driven guy.
Really?
I'm a data-driven guy, and I think you probably are too, based on
absolutely
what little I know. So look at the polling data on the aftermath and before and after. There are more than enough people. It's not even by a super small margin that say they would have changed their vote had they been exposed to that information before that election. The fact is that was systematically suppressed in what was probably the single greatest form of election interference in American history.
Vivek has a very clear perspective that he lays out here, that if the Hunter Biden story, which was prevented from going forth before the election, was not suppressed in that way, that it would have changed votes. And I think what he's basing that perspective on is a poll. It was conducted by a more conservative organization, Media Research Center. They did a poll of 1,750 voters in 7 swing states, and they found that 1/6 of Joe Biden voters, based on this very small sample size, would have changed their vote if they had been confronted with the Hunter Biden laptop story. Okay, 17% of voters, based on the poll. Obviously, it's one poll. It's very limited. It was done by a conservative organization. So there's going to be perhaps some level of bias involved. You can say all of that. But I certainly understand the argument that the Hunter Biden laptop story, if it had been released, would have had an influence on certain Joe Biden voters. That's the first thing. The second thing here is sort of alluding to what I talked about before. The Hunter Biden laptop story has become such a GOP trope. Whenever a liberal asks a conservative, so do you think the election was actually stolen? And the response is, in some capacity, well, the Hunter Biden laptop story. Immediate backfire effect. Immediate backfire effect. I went into David Pakman's comment section and I looked at a whole bunch of people who were saying, once Vivek mentioned Hunter Biden's laptop story, I stopped listening. Now, there's another side to this as well, which I'm going to get into later, but let's go back to the reaction for now, because you probably want to see how he continues this whole thing.
So you get the full freight of my view here.
Yeah.
There was a lot of discussion about the legitimacy of the 2016 election on the back of Russian election interference that actually, it turns out, was actually much smaller scale than surmised. But on the day of Trump's inauguration, there was a lot of discussion. Hillary Clinton called the election result illegitimate and said that it was partly the product of Russian election interference. Whatever that was, that pales in comparison,
really,
to the effect of the systematic suppression on domestic soil of a story that 2 years later, every news outlet in this country has absolutely admitted was indeed true when it was systematically suppressed at the time.
So you get a little bit of David Pakman's, let's call it, condescending, slightly sarcastic, incredulous act that he puts forth at times. Like the really... Pakman has a very funny way of doing interviews with guests that he disagrees with. And Vivek, near the end here, actually calls him out on it a bit, which was a very tense moment. I think Pakman would admit that someone like Vivek is far more intelligent and thoughtful than someone like Jesse Lee Peterson.
Beta!
Right? And Pakman's done interviews with Jesse Lee Peterson. The way he approaches those interviews is he doesn't take it too seriously.
A real man are conservative, Republican, and strong in nature.
If I became conservative, would I no longer be beta?
You become alpha.
Well,
he just sort of brushes it aside, answers sarcastically, because a lot of what Jesse says, and I think this too, is complete bogus.
In terms of a factual vote dumps or sandwiches and ballots under the table or vans backing in, Mike Lindell, cyber guys looking for bamboo fibers on the ballots. You're not talking about any of that. You're simply saying, had some people known about the allegations related to Hunter Biden at the time, enough people in some states might have changed their votes such that Trump would have gotten to 270. That's your position.
If that story had not been systematically top-down suppressed.
I gotcha.
I think there's good data to suggest it.
Yep, and he wants to reassert his position there. I think from a persuasive angle, just in terms of persuading the other side, I think it's far more effective to listen to Pakman's attempted steelman of his position and say, yes, Pakman didn't use the language systematically suppressed, so Vivek wanted to return to that specific language. But the content was similar.
Yes, it could have changed the result of the election.
Okay, good. And the point, again, is not to debate it with you, but to get your position on the record. Good.
It's data-driven, so it's not really
I'm super interested in your campaign.
I also was looking at some of the comments in Pakman's section, and people were mocking the fact that Vivek called himself data-driven because he didn't actually reference the poll that he bases his opinion on. This is also what happens. When you say you're data-driven, but then you don't bring up the specifics, people on the other side are immediately going to turn their ears off, even if it is data-driven.
Because you are right now one of the people that Donald Trump is saying nice things about in general. He mispronounces your name badly, Ramaswamy, which you may care about, you may not. That's for you to decide. But
it's been an affliction in my life, I will tell you. but I've grown used to it. Best efforts are what I appreciate.
He is generally saying the reason you're surging, he said this Saturday, is because you're actually mostly treating him well, treating him fairly, etc.
He does say
You're
that.
roughly polling 5% right now, Real Clear Politics average. I'm sure there are anecdotal
He's doing well. What can I say?
polls that have you higher and lower, but the Real Clear Politics average has you right around 5 right now.
I'm a distant third at 5.
You're a distant third at 5. You do seem to have taken a commanding position ahead of Mike Pence, though, and that we can talk about as well, maybe. My question is, from a practical standpoint, is your perspective on Trump calculated in order to sort of be there in case Trump really can't run a campaign because he gets arrested a 3rd, a 4th, a 5th time, maybe even 6th? Is the idea not to turn off the MAGA voter so that if Trump hits trouble, they go to you rather than maybe DeSantis or somebody else? Is that a consideration?
Here is the first attempt to question Vivek's authenticity. Is he making a political calculation to not turn off Donald Trump voters, given that they represent a majority or hefty plurality of the Republican base? Let's listen to his answer.
It's not a political calculation. My whole political strategy in this race is to speak the truth, at least share my beliefs, tell the people who I am and what I stand for, and leave it to the voters to decide whether that's what they want.
Okay.
And so if I come out of this election where everybody in this country...
You could hear a little bit of the skepticism in Pakman's voice. Okay, right. You say that, I don't quite buy it.
Knows who I am and what I stand for, and that's not what they want. I'm at peace with that. I'm very much at peace with that. And that's exactly the system working as it should. The more I learn about and the experiences I have, the more difficult I realize how hard that is for certainly me and probably any other candidate to actually achieve that goal. But anyway, the reason I'm saying what I am is I actually do believe that Donald Trump was an effective president. He was an effective president. No doubt about it. I think he was...
He chooses his words very carefully there. Effective speaks much more to how he was able to navigate the political landscape rather than being able to bring a country together. And there's a difference between being honest and open. You can be honest about what you say without disclosing some things that you believe would be deleterious to disclose. One of the issues I have, people getting into politics will try to make the claim, I'm not making political calculations. Right? I'm just trying to speak truthfully as to what I believe. I'm not saying that you aren't, but there are certain details, certainly, that will be omitted on account of not being a productive disclosure. If I were to share all of my opinion on this topic, I would alienate certain people that are essential to my electability in the Republican Party. The point of all of that is to say, yes, Vivek, you are claiming that you're not making a political calculation. Maybe you aren't consciously making a political calculation, but deep down, there are voters that if you are to criticize Trump too heavily, that you will turn them off. When he criticizes Trump as not being a good unifier for the country, you're going to see in a moment what he does.
Agenda even further than he did, and unite the country in the process. Because for whatever reason, and I don't blame him for this, but I think it's just a fact.
I don't blame him for this. He's going to take the blame off of Trump. He's going to say there is a problem with Donald Trump as a character in his ability to unite people. But I don't blame him for that.
That about 30% of this country becomes, I would say mentally ill in a certain form, psychiatrically
ill. And so he puts that blame for Trump's lack of ability to unite people on the 30% that cannot function, that cannot come to terms that Donald Trump might occasionally say something that is true, that they agree with. And I would argue that reframing of it's not Trump's fault, it's actually somewhat the fault of the 30% of liberal voters, is a political calculation.
Ill.
I've heard you say that.
Yeah. They agree with things that they otherwise wouldn't have agreed with. They start disagreeing with things they otherwise would have agreed with just because he's saying them. And I think that for whatever reason, I'm not yet having that effect on people, and I don't think I will.
No,
and that
you
allows
don't
us
seem to make people crazy. The interesting thing about the psychiatric...
And that's simply the truth. Vivek is not having that effect on people. He doesn't have that effect on me either. Just full disclosure. I can't vote for Donald Trump. I don't think he's good for the country. I don't think he's a good dude either. I think Donald Trump has the image of the Trump brand in his mind, much more so than he does ordinary people. I can vote for Vivek. This is coming from someone, by the way, who voted for Jill Stein in 2016. Okay, Bernie Sanders at some point, and Andrew Yang. You could argue there's a bit of a stepwise motion to the right there. Fair enough. The point is, I've been voting for people on the left ever since the point that I've been eligible to vote. And I'm considering this time, yeah, this Republican makes sense. And I do think there's a lot of people who toe the political line in a similar way that would be open to someone like this. When Vivek says, I can deliver a Reagan landslide election, he's not kidding. He's not kidding. I think he can deliver a Reagan landslide election. But it's going to be about getting the Trump people on board to vote for him. It's going to be tough. That's going to be tough for them to abandon their primary candidate.
But one of the interesting things is I was in Chicago last weekend. I was sitting very close proximity to a table of MAGA folks who were talking about the primary. And I was just listening in like a fly on the wall. It was an incredible sociological experience as a progressive. I was out of my bubble. And they start talking about, you know who's really in charge? It's Obama through the military. And then someone else says, you know, the vaccines, this and that and the other thing. And someone else says, you know, we got to get rid of the deep state. And one guy goes, you know who I like? I like that Indian guy. They didn't know your name. They didn't know your name, but they refer to you as that Indian guy because he's not part of the deep state, et cetera, et cetera. The definition of...
How do you know he's not part of the deep state? Food for thought.
Of what we mean by psychiatric illness. A lot of the stuff I'm hearing from folks about JFK Jr.'s alive and all this different conspiracy stuff that surrounds MAGA, it seems as though when we start just saying psychiatric illness, I don't know if it gets us to where the country is and what would be best for it necessarily, which is why I wonder about this talking point you've come up with about Trump makes a third of the country psychiatrically ill. What are you getting at when you say that?
I'm describing the fact of many people in this country disagreeing with policies that they otherwise would have agreed with, that I believe are good for this country, that Trump believed are good for this country, that they put themselves at odds with just because he's the person.
And that was excellently stated.
If the public health professionals, if Dr. Fauci, if the doctors tell us that we should take it, I'll be the first in line to take it. Absolutely. But if Donald Trump tells us that we should take it, I'm not taking it.
At odds with just because he's the person arguing for them. Like at the southern border, for example. I went to speak of Chicago, since I'll reminded me of my experience of going to Chicago recently.
You didn't sit next to these people I sat next to, I'm guessing.
No, and actually I share with you a commitment to get outside my own bubble too.
Yeah.
So I went to the south side of Chicago where Republican candidates don't go.
Right.
So nearly 90% black audience, most of whom are viewed as deep Democrat country. We held a couple of town halls. I got my hair cut at a barbershop. We visited South Shore High School in Chicago, which is partly being converted into an encampment for migrants who are crossing the southern border. I'll tell you what I found. I found some of the most ardent supporters of sealing the southern border who I have met in my life. Didn't come at a conservative MAGA rally. It came on the south side of Chicago. And I think that that's just one example among many. I found some of the fiercest opposition to our war in Ukraine,
What do you notice about both of those things? What you notice is that both of those come back around to focusing more on the citizens here at home. People on the south side of Chicago, they're just as resentful of the fact that the government is off spending all of this money trying to do things overseas as your average conservative. Because when the government's spending all this money over here, you're not paying attention to us. We're struggling here. We need help. Our communities are suffering. What does immigration mean if there is no commensurate assimilation into the country?
By the way, I share in common. And so I don't think the real partisan boundaries that the media teaches us to accept, those aren't the real divisions in this country right now. I think there are different divisions. They do not track traditional Republican Democrat boundaries. That's an artificial projection.
Are they class divisions more so, or what are they?
Well, I see it as, I cut it through, I think there's some element of class division. I think that there's a deeper division between what I call the managerial class and the citizen. And I think the managerial class pervades multiple institutions. It's not just in government. That is what we call the deep state. The same kinds of people, if not some of the same people, who are the associate deans of God knows what at a proliferating cancer of managerialism at universities, that professionally sit on corporate boards, that become the ambassador of God knows what to some third world, or sort of second bit nation as a gig that they take on. This is the undersecretary of God knows what in the next administration. It's the rise of the managerial class that wields far more power than our founding fathers ever envisioned.
That applies to academia, by the way. I'm going to make a video on my Gestalt channel talking about how academia has been taken over by this complete bloating of an administrative class, paying all of these administrators gobs and gobs of money, charging normal citizens tuition up the wazoo. People get into large amounts of debt. The value of the college degree is devaluating, and the wealthy administrators are lining their pockets with cash.
Dismiss whoever they heard as a bunch of crazies.
Well, Obama's still in charge secretly through the military. He's a little nuts, right?
Well, let me just that's facile. Okay, let's just double click on that a little bit.
Sure.
What's the intuition? What's the intuition there? The intuition is that Joe Biden, the duly elected president of the United States, supposedly the person in charge, is actually in charge, making the decisions. I don't think he is. I don't think many people in the Democratic Party think that he is. I think it is a managerial.
And it would be hard to believe that Joe Biden, in the current cognitive state that he is in, is actually in charge of things. That is reasonable intuition. Because running a country is hard. In the same way I would say we just saw Mitch McConnell freeze up at a press conference. Do you think that guy's really the minority leader in the Senate? Really? At this point? I mean, yeah, by title. But is he really the one making big decisions? Probably not. The dude can barely finish a press conference. Okay, and this really speaks to the dishonesty of Washington. We are really living in a time with just a bunch of puppets. And that should piss people off. That should piss people off whether you're right or left. You should be pissed off by the fact that the supposed president of the United States looks like that and sounds like that, and that the supposed minority leader of the Senate looks and sounds like that. It's absurd. It's a clown country.
Class that finds him as a convenient vehicle for advancing a particular agenda.
Okay, but are there any of these examples you wouldn't defend? Like, we've gone to Trump rallies and they say Trump's actually still in charge because the generals swore an oath to him. Are you willing to say is there some version of that one that you think
Trump
is
not in charge? That's why he is taking great pains to run for president of the United States.
Okay, so that one's just wrong. That one you're not.
And that's good. It's a very straight, direct answer.
Wrong. That one you're not going to equivocate on.
But is it David or Peck? How should I address you?
You can call me anything you want, Vivek.
Okay, got it. I'll call you David. And thank you for saying my name correctly. It is Vivek. So here's what I will say. I think you and I share this in common. I'll speak for myself, and I'll give you the assumption to start with that you share this in common is
sure.
We care about reviving a national identity and a nation we can be proud of that is united around the principles that set us into motion 250 years ago. That's certainly what I care about. I think that is still possible in this country. I don't know that 20 years from now it'll be possible. I think it's still possible in this country right now. I think you and I are not on the side of a national divorce. If that's the case, then we need to be able to pierce through what somebody, because I went on the Breakfast Club. I don't know if did you see that interview?
I saw it, of course.
Yeah.
We did deep prep.
I appreciate that. Deep prep. I appreciate deep prep. So I had a moment in that interview where I could probably have done to this woman, I forget her name, what you might be able to do to the people who were in that room with you in Illinois, which is to take a speck of what she said and then just say, this is my occasion to bury her. I kind of had that moment on set with Don Lemon and decided to take it. As it relates to the conspiracy theorizing on the right,
sure,
that as you'll label, okay? So first of all, I think it's worth just doing a recounting of the last 24 months in this country, right? We were told that a virus that did not originate in a lab in Wuhan, if you said it did, that you were racist and had your social media accounts locked.
Okay, if we
now know Vivek, that it originated,
only
right?
Because we have limited time and we've gotten this list so many times. I know where you're going with this, which is sometimes people have been wrong about certain things.
Not sometimes, many times would be my only point, because I could go.
And not just many times, on the preeminent issues in the country and in the world. COVID coming from a lab. A very intuitive position to think that perhaps a coronavirus came from the Wuhan coronavirus lab. I mean, who would have thought?
Oh my
if there was
God.
evidence, I'd love to hear it. I
There's
just don't know.
a novel respiratory coronavirus overtaking Wuhan, China. What do we do? Oh, you know who we could ask? The Wuhan novel respiratory coronavirus lab. The disease is the same name as the lab.
And there were people, liars in the media, saying, nope, that's not true. Didn't come from a lab. When a lot of people, including myself, were like, that's a bunch of shit they are trying to pump down people's throats. And it comes out. The truth does come out. Oh yeah, no, probably came from a lab. And they lied about that. They lied about it to everybody. How can you trust these people? And so when it comes to thinking about conspiracies, yeah, some might seem more wild than others, but you at least have to consider the possibility that there might be more legitimacy to a conspiracy theory than you would otherwise think in a time like this, where your major institutions are so dishonest.
And sort of narrowly solve for, can you denounce that as false? You're playing the wrong game, especially against the backdrop that is not reading a room correctly.
Yeah.
Where time and again, and it is, and so you'll cut me off appropriately because you know the list as well as I do, but time and again, it has to be measured against the backdrop of every major instance that has been systematically suppressed has come out to have had some element of truth to it.
Fair.
And I think it's against that backdrop we have that conversation.
Look at that. Fair. When it comes to the specific policy decisions being made, especially economically, they disagree on so much. But look at that. We had the moment of fair. Sometimes that's all you can ask for.
So I can hit a couple other things.
Yeah.
I want to leave it at, I think there's a difference between recognizing that, for example, how effective vaccines are against the latest variant is different than Trump is in control right now because the general swore a loyalty oath. As long as we can agree those are two different things and we can talk about both.
And what he's talking about here is being able to categorize tiers of conspiracy. But Vivek's point wasn't actually about the vaccines themselves. It was about the source of COVID. And the source of COVID, that was a highly contentious topic. And to even bring up that it could have come from a lab, it would have called you the one who is spreading disinformation for saying it came from a lab. How can you trust people that are so intent on controlling the narrative?
So I want to say something, which I've said before, but it doesn't seem to matter, but I'm going to say it anyway. The media seems to be the one that uses a label of anti-woke to describe my campaign. I am running a campaign to revive national identity. And at the time I wrote Woke Inc., you know what people criticized the title back then? People said, nobody knows what this word is. And unlike many on both the left and right, I will define exactly what it is that I view as a symptom of a deeper malaise in our current.
I thought you were going to define woke itself.
No, well, wokeness is a symptom, and I will define the symptom, but it is also a deeper cancer. And wokeness is a worldview that says that there are certain invisible social relationships between us, grounded on oppression or oppressor relationships and statuses of people, based on race, gender, and sexuality. That you're either oppressor or oppressed based on those genetic attributes. That there are invisible societal injustices resulting from them, and that we have to be awake, alert to those injustices and then correct for them. Left or right, I think that's a neutral definition that describes at least what we're talking about here.
That is one of the best definitions I've ever heard impromptu. Now, you're going to get some pushback here, but listen to how he responds to the pushback, too.
I have a different one, which is much simpler, which is simply becoming woke is becoming aware that there are problems in our society bigger than any one person's circumstances. That's how I...
Except that designation can describe issues both on the right and left. And when we're talking about wokeism, we are specifically talking about ideas coming from the left. And Vivek's going to articulate this.
And I know it's very different from what you're saying.
That's a slightly different definition, and one that is set up for more people to agree with it. But I think that that's not. I respectfully, David, that's a definition that on its own does not support the specificity of policies that follow from it.
Brilliant. When we are talking about woke, that implies certain policies arising from the premise of wokeness. And those are fundamentally left-wing policies. And he just always struck that down with precision.
We see, and so I think we have to owe it to ourselves to at least be specific and get on the table, where I'll give Ibram Kendi at least some credit for being specific when he expressly says the right answer to past discrimination is present discrimination. The right answer to present discrimination is future discrimination. Those are his words, not mine. You have to take people like Ayanna Pressley at their word. We don't want any more black or brown faces that don't want to be a black or brown voice. But we have to smoke that out, where there are policies that directly track what the leading advocates of this movement have said in their own words. That's not me putting words in anybody else's mouth. And I think we just have to own that up and get that on the table so we can actually have an honest, clean-hearted debate about it.
Yeah,
right? We can
what's
debate
interesting
what's right
about
or wrong.
that is most of the examples you're coming up with as someone on the progressive left are not examples I would defend. And simultaneously, it sounds like you're also not denying that when it comes to the way we treat people, when it comes to the questions asked in these polls about wokeness, when it comes to trans, controlling books, drag shows, etc., I'm not hearing that that's actually the fight you really want to have, which if that's the case, I like that. I think that that's good.
Yeah, well, here's the one fight on that narrow issue that I do care to have is as it relates to kids.
Oh, and I love that he points this out,
So
too.
I believe that, and what I'm about to say is controversial to some, but I'm going to share my view, and I think it's grounded in history and fact and my true perspective. I think that gender dysphoria, especially in kids, is a mental health condition that and should be treated as such. And for most of our history, all the way through the DSM-4, and I believe the DSM-5 has been viewed that way.
It absolutely has. I actually made a video on this titled The Myth of Mental Illness on my second channel, my main channel. I'll plug it right now. Go there, Gestalt Productions. I'll put a little card here. Check it out. You'll find that video compelling as well.
When a kid says that their gender does not match their biological sex, that is usually evidence that something else is wrong in their life, and we should get to the bottom of that. I do not believe it is compassionate to affirm that kid's confusion. I believe that is cruelty. We do not allow kids to get a tattoo before the age of 18. We should not allow kids to undergo genital mutilation or chemical castration.
Now, of
below
course,
the
you
age
can
of
get a
18.
tattoo before the age of 18 with parents' permission, and that's what many want to see.
Actually,
here.
many states you can't.
I'm not aware of any such states, but I take your word that there are some where that's the case. I mean, listen, on that issue, and we're out of time, and I'm going to let you go because I know that that you have a lot of things to get to. On that issue, I do want to say that in every state I'm aware of, the issue of gender dysphoria in kids does start as a behavioral health intervention. I think the question becomes, and I don't have I don't pretend to.
That's in the DSM-5 as it is currently. We'll see about the DSM-6 when it comes out.
How far is it okay to go beyond that? I am with you that I don't yet believe we have the full 2020 hindsight on it.
The one thing I will leave with you on this too, and you seem like I appreciate your reasoned approach here to having a conversation, something I don't always get, is if gender dysphoria is such a condition of suffering, and I believe it is, in the rare instances in which it occurs, why on earth are we now going out of our way to create more of it? By purposefully weaving in the possibilities for gender confusion at ages where literally, and there's good evidence to back this up, when there's one case of gender dysphoria in a school, it spreads. Like you could do the R-squared math on this, right? It's like,
I mean, come on. Can you imagine Trump talking about R-squared values? About correlation coefficients? This is just stuff that never comes out of a politician's mouth. Talking about R-squared values. Epidemiologically tracked growth.
You could compare that to COVID, the spread of COVID, and you can epidemiologically model this stuff. Yes, this is actually having an effect that we're going out of our way to create a condition that we say creates more suffering. I'll give you one example in New Hampshire where I travel.
We're an imitative species. Children imitate their parents. Children imitate other children. When you have children adopting a framework that it is completely normal to have dissonance between one's gender expression and their sex, that phenomenon will spread due to the consequence of imitation. This is something that Thomas Saz talks about. Thomas Saz, he's a psychologist, talked about this in a book called The Myth of Mental Illness. Talk about how many of the categories that we come up with regarding mental illness are culturally constructed. Now, when it comes to something like gender dysphoria, then you have to ask the question, okay, why is this growing? What are the, not just what are the harmful consequences of it? Are there certain beneficial consequences of something like gender dysphoria growing? Is there an evolutionary purpose for something like gender dysphoria growing? And that's an interesting question. I'm getting a little bit into the weeds here.
The state just shot down a piece of legislation. All it said was, if a kid in school identifies as a gender different than their biological sex, the parent has a right to know. And over a lot of activism and opposition, they shot that bill down, which is odd because the whole premise is that kids are at heightened risk of suicide, in fact. And so a parent doesn't have the right to know if their kid's showing up in school with the condition that the whole premise for the movement was the kid is at higher risk of mental health condition or suicide. It says there's something else going on here.
Yeah,
right? This is not compassion.
We talked about one of those laws recently. I expressed the same concern, which is we don't necessarily want to, quote, out a child that is not ready or maybe outed into an unsafe home environment on the one hand, the other side being exactly what you're saying. So I think all of these issues are more complicated than both
and David,
sides.
before we rock and roll, not on this, but on just a synthesis of this conversation, I just feel, I'm on a mission to lead not a political party, but a nation. And I will share with you a commitment that I'm willing to make. And I hope that provides some inspiration to people who disagree with me on many issues like yourself. I hope
you're not about to offer me press secretary.
We have to get to know each other better before I make that offer. But maybe you're on the short list. I don't know. But here's what I'll say.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that we all need to do better of smoking out the best argument for the side that we actually disagree with to contend with that.
Bingo. Conservatives and liberals, this is a problem across the board. We all do this. If we have a commitment to our own ideological positions, we want to affirm them in any way that we can. And so we strike down our opponent's positions that are weak instead of contending with the real challenges to our own. I can't believe we have a presidential candidate who actually said something like that. It's just so sober and reasonable.
And if you spot an instance where you think I'm not, then get that on the table. But what frustrates me, and it does frustrate me, is that I see a lot of, and I know this world, man. Like I came from it, right? I graduated from the top of my class at Harvard. I've been through Yale Law School. I'm working at a hedge fund in New York. Like, let's just get real here. Like, I know you. We haven't met before, but I know you in some sense of the word, okay? Like, you're not unfamiliar to me. And what I see amongst even my peers, right, is a form of laziness. I think I'm saying this out of respect and not an attack, in a constructive way. I saw a little bit of it in the start of this conversation, right? Where you're going to be able to smoke out a version of that which can be caricatured, but these are our fellow citizens. And their concerns come from a deep place where if you can do a better job of articulating and smoking out where that concern.
That's a really hard thing to say to someone directly. I agree with him. Although I will say it's quite arrogant to presume that you have such a good psychological read on someone. I know you. I come from the same background. A risky thing to say in conversation. You can easily turn someone off. But I understand what Vivek's getting at here. There's a large swath of liberals that look at many of the conspiratorial beliefs that come from Trump voters as pathetic, honestly. I felt this myself too.
Comes from, then we have an obligation to do it. And that's what gives me my motivation in this race, where people will say, somebody living 50 miles radius of where I am in central Ohio today and say, well, they say the First Amendment applies to tech companies. They're rubes because they don't know that only applies to the government. Actually, to double click on that and say, you know what, there's something to that intuition. And it turns out if a private actor is doing what the government actually implicitly goaded them to do, then the First Amendment does apply. In every instance, to be able to say that when there's something of value there, don't just sweep that under the rug and reject it, smoke it out, and then let's have that real debate.
And with respect
to the woke or trans case, I'll do the same. I am doing the same. That's what we got to do.
I'm with you in general. I think 3 times now, you've deliberately blurred very different types of issues. We have a real situation in this country where a whole bunch of people think Trump either won or is currently the president. It's very different than tech and First Amendment. We've got to leave it there. That is a disagreement we have about the similarity between those situations. I could talk to you for another hour. I want to be respectful of your time.
But thank you, man.
Vivek Ramaswamy, he's running for president on the Republican side. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, my man.
I thought it was a fabulous interview. And the last point that David made there, people actually believe that Trump, at the end of the day, had more votes. Sorry, disagree with you. I don't think our democracy is that corrupt at this point. Maybe I'm the one being duped. But, yeah, I mean, it's even the fact that we're in this situation where we're so divided on such a fundamental question. Who won the election? It's scary stuff. It's not too far off that you get from this point into no more electoral representation. We're going to need a new group of leaders. I think a young group of leaders is going to do great things. And this guy's 37. A lot of people say he's too young. I think the old people have done enough. Maybe that's a little bit of my youth bias showing. I think these gerontocratic bureaucrats I think they've done enough damage. I think it's time to take the brightest from both the right and the left and bring them together. I think this guy's part of the equation. We'll see.